Hello again, everybody. Today we're going to be doing something just a little more complicated than a couple of our more recent drawings. As you can see, this is a very, very sped up drawing video. It's a little bit more sped up than my other videos, and that's because we are drawing a pineapple today, and it gets a little detail focused. I get a little detail focused for this pineapple. It ended up, don't let how fast this is going fool you. I took around 4 hours to finish this pineapple. So that's why the video's as sped up as it is. Right now, I'm just starting out with my really light tones on the leaves of my pineapple. You always put the light tones in first when you're painting in this style, this watercolor style that I'm using, even though I'm painting with India inks. And that's so that you can put the darker tones in over top of it without covering up all of the light tones completely, so that they add dimensionality to your drawing. And now I'm adding that same yellow color to my main pineapple here, making sure to carefully outline the little papery tassels. I don't know what that part of the pineapple is called, but it's a little triangular papery tassel that is at the very end of each little pineapple chunk. And I want to make those a particular color. So even though I'm doing the rest of this pineapple with this sort of dull yellow color to start out with, I'm leaving those spots white so that I can go in later with my I think it's a reddish color. I decide to make those little tassels. So now I'm just putting in this yellow. I'm pretty sure that this is just standard yellow. I might have added a drop or two of green to tone down the brightness of my yellow a little bit, but it's mostly just canary yellow. See, now you can see I'm going in with just my regular green and starting to outline where I want my shadows to be on my little pineapple leaves. But then I decided that I knew where the shadows were going to be more on the pineapple, so I decided to go through and outline those shadows first, because a pineapple is very sectional, and you have to really darken those sections up. Not completely black by any means, because then your pineapple would end up looking a little cartoony. So I guess if that's what you're going for, then go ahead. But I started out with a pretty light gray mixed in with just a little bit of green, and I outlined each of these little octagonal, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pentagonal little sections of coconut. I don't have the pencil drawing. I didn't take a picture of the pencil drawing for this pineapple, but I could probably recreate it if anyone wants a copy of the pencil drawing for this one, because it was really nice. It was a nice pineapple. It was a pineapple I bought at the store, and it just looked so lovely that I couldn't not paint it. So here we are. And it was a bright green pineapple, really. These yellows are just going to be the highlight in the end. I'm just adding in. I tried to add in my greens for the pineapple leaves in a sort of stripy texture. The leaves of a pineapple are they have a very firm texture to them of lines radiating from the base of the leaf and meeting up at the point. And so I tried to use my brush to recreate those lines a little bit with some stripes of green. And I think it turned out all right. Those stripes shone through in the end. Drying out all the little pineapple chunks did take quite a while, though. I wonder, see, the 4 hours I mentioned earlier was just how long it took me to paint this. It's how much video footage that I have. I'm not sure how long it took me to do the painting or the pencil drawing initially. That just adds more time. This was a complicated, I'd never drawn a pineapple before, and I really got bogged down in those details. That's why I'm being very cautious with my additions of color, is because I'd never done a drawing or a painting, I suppose, that had so much of these very defined deep parts, shadowy parts, so close to a very brightly defined surface area. So I started very, very, very light with some very, very light colors, and as I'm going, I'm adding shading to each of the little pieces in green, and I'm also darkening up the crevice in between each section as I go. Just little by little, this dark gray mixed with a little bit of green just keeps layering up on all of these dark crevices. It's really a patience game with something like a pineapple, where there's a lot of repetitive motions and well, I mean, it's a pattern is what it is. That's the whole reason that I thought of drawing this in the first place, aside from being presented with a lovely pineapple. It was one of my Inktober prompts this last October. This was the prompt pattern, and I thought this was a lovely pattern, and it was a lovely pattern. It was a little more time consuming than I had anticipated, but I suppose I did more fiddling with it than was strictly necessary. But again, I don't think it was a waste. I think you should go slowly and build up your details in many, 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 many layers. And that's how you get a really standout piece at the end. And now I'm adding in some more shadows to these leaves. These leaves had a lot of really complicated shadows the longer that I looked at them, because there were so many of them, and they all cast the shadow and they all caught the light in a different way. So you really got to take your time and add in those shadows really slowly, because once you add in too many shadows, then you're kind of stuck with India ink. Unlike with watercolors, with India ink, once your layer is dry, it will not, when you re-wet it, it will not come up. The pigment is there to stay. So if you put down too many shadows too fast, you're kind of stuck with that unless you want to restart your whole piece. So if you're using India inks, definitely go slow. I found watercolor to be a little bit more forgiving, just because you can re-wet a hard edge or a wrong line and shade it out softly into some other color. But not with inks. Inks are a special challenge. So I'm very carefully, you can see I'm adding the stripy lines with my shadow. That's another effort on my part to recreate that texture. And these are actually, funnily enough, my favorite part of this pineapple, I think, are these little tiny places where the leaves of the pineapple curl over at the very tip. I don't know why, but I really like that little detail. It's one of my favorite little details of the whole piece. And I suggest that you also focus on little details like that, just little things, and don't add too many. You have to be sparing with your little details, because they really add together to create a visually interesting piece. So don't forego some fun little details. You might have fun doing them too. Oh, here I'm starting to add these little papery bits that I don't know what they're called. Do we have any botanists? Maybe botanists listening to this video? Do you know what the little papery tassel on each section of the coconut is called? Because I do not. And the papery corners on the actual pineapple were relatively yellowish. They were a very dull papyrus color. And I liked that color, but I didn't feel that it stood out well enough against this light yellowy green base that I was laying down. So I sort of used some artistic license here and added a little bit of a warmer reddish tone to these little tassels. And I really like how it turned out. It complemented the green and yellow of the pineapple, and as you'll see here a little later, it also drew the pineapple into the whole scene because the background had a lot of warm reddish tones in it. And I felt like that really made it more of a cohesive piece than it maybe would have been. And I'm being very careful with these little papery tassels because you have to make sure to capture how the shadow lies on these little tassels because they're like tiny pockets that rest along each individual section of the pineapple. So you need to make sure to represent their three-dimensionality with a little bit of shading. And I've got on the very edges, see in the same way that the little flip at the end of the pineapple leaves was one of my favorite details. Also on the main pineapple, where those little papery tassels hang out off the side of the pineapple, that really helps sell the idea that they're each a three-dimensional little pocket and not just a flat thing that rests against the side of the pineapple. And see, now I know definitely where all my little deep grooves are going to be. I'm going in with a much, much darker color right here. You have to be brave sometimes. And this was it for me. I'm going in with a dark color, and it stands out really dramatically against these first pale layers I've got going for this pineapple. And it looks pretty strange at this point. I think there's always a point halfway through a drawing where it looks just too weird, like you're never sure if you can salvage how this is starting to look. But I think most drawings have that awkward middle stage somewhere. And really all you can do is keep working and keep adding details and keep adding shading and building up your layers one at a time until you can finally be happy with what you've created. You see, I'm using a paper towel to splotch up some of the darker areas of ink because I want that to be a dark area, but I don't want it to be completely black. So by splotching up the dark ink a few seconds after I'd laid it down, I'm taking up a lot of the main color and leaving sort of a shadowy half-tone color in its place instead of just a solid black. And that's an effective way to use black without it looking too dark, is just set it down on your paper. Make sure your ink, your brush is very wet, has a nice concentration of water in there. And then you lay your black color down and then very quickly blot it up with a paper towel, and it will leave a really lovely, smoky, semi-translucent tone, even with your black ink. And black ink is one of the hardest things to get a nice translucent tone with if you're putting it on thickly. So that's my India ink tip for this video. And now I'm going through, looks like I had a different cut, and I am adding in some more of these leaves. These leaves, they did frustrate me for a while because there are so many. There's so many of the leaves. And I like a few of them more than I like some of the others. Some of them I kind of flubbed the shading a little bit, but it came together. That's the thing about having a complicated piece like this, is there'll always be little things that feel like mistakes to you, but your average person looking at your finished piece will never see those little mistakes that you do. So you just got to keep going and making a piece you can be proud of. That isn't perfect because nothing is. None of your pieces will ever be perfect, and you will only hurt yourself expecting perfection from all of your art. You have to allow yourself to explore. You really explore the medium and have a good time. Have a good time with it. Now, see, here's an example of one of my own mistakes. I think I would have put in some masking fluid on a few of these sections of the main pineapple where there are some really bright reflections, where the shiny pineapple piece reflects the light. And I got those reflections in later on, but I feel like they would have been more dramatic if I had masked them in initially before I started painting, and then let that white of the paper shine through at the end. It's always nice when you can leave the whitest part of your painting, the white of the paper showing through when you're doing watercolors or India inks like this, because it really adds a whole new level of contrast to the piece. Now we're about probably halfway done with this. The rest is just detailing, just minor detailing. You've got a really good idea of where this is going. And this is the point of a drawing where you're starting to see like a light at the end of the tunnel. You got through the really awkward phase and you persevered, you added more layers. And now you're finally starting to see where this is going and how it looks, how it's going to look in the end. And that's where you really ramp up your efforts and add in all these little details, which is what I'm doing now. I'm adding some shadows. I'm adding the little circle. The pineapple pieces were this pentagonal shape with a circle in the center, and over top of each circle swooped that papery tassel that I was talking about earlier. So you don't see the complete circle in any of these pieces because part of it is hidden by that little triangular tassel. Now everything's dried and I'm coming back in for the background here. Definitely make sure your main subject is dry before trying to add the background, or else your colors will bleed in. See, I had some issue with my cool tassels hanging off the side blending in a little too much with this background, but it gets fixed up. It gets fixed up as we go. In the background, I probably could have put in a little bit earlier. I decided to put it in when I was about halfway done with the pineapple itself. Mostly because I wasn't completely confident. I wasn't completely confident in my ability to paint this pineapple. I have to be honest with you guys. So I got a good idea of how my pineapple was going, and I decided I really needed to get this background in before I went to all the work of doing all these finishing details. And that's a good policy, I think, for anyone, because if you mess up a little bit and get some of your background over your pineapple, then you can just fix it as you go in with your details later on. And I'd used a super pale color over the top section, mostly to show variation from the table, the very, very dark table the pineapple was resting on, but also because there were so many little flippy bits and pointy bits and little tiny bits of leaf that pineapple top is made out of, and I really wanted to not have to super carefully trace around each of those little things. So by making a really light wash for my background, I toned the paper so that there wasn't that glaring white behind my pineapple, but I also was able to just sort of less carefully wash that color around my leaves there without worrying about it coloring the leaves themselves too much. And that's a good trick, because even if I got these leaves a little pinky at the very outside edges, as I go in and finish my details, that'll be covered up. So it's another fun trick for India ink: light washes over things that you do not want to trace around super carefully. And now I'm starting to try and add some of these reflections, and this is again where I'm having some problems with my white India ink, but I think I end up mixing it with a little tiny bit of acrylic to give it a little more opacity, I suppose is the term. It's slipping my mind all of a sudden. But anyways, I'm adding in a little bit of shadowing, a little bit of a darker brown because I thought that my little tassels were blending in too much to all the main colors in my pineapple. So I've got this darker reddish brown, and I'm outlining some of my tassels, and this is where you can see the detail in the edges of the little tassels coming through, because it's not a sharp point on all of them, and it's not a sharp edge. It's a tassel-y bit. It zigs and zags a little bit. And now you'll be like, oh my gosh, you're adding even more darkness in between these sections. And I am, because it's very dark in between those sections. Those sections have a very deep groove in between them. It's very dramatic, really. If you've ever taken the time to really stare at a pineapple, you may have noticed. And these dark lines, they stand out quite a lot right now, but as we start adding in some more shading to the pineapple itself to give it a rounder shape, then those black lines will really just blend right into our shading. And you'll notice that I'm making the recesses darkest on the lower right side of the pineapple, and that's because that's where the shadow is on the main pineapple. The light is coming in from the upper left side of this pineapple. So as the grooves move their way toward the upper left side where the light is, it gets paler and paler. It's not quite as dark of a shadow. Now I'm adding in my shading, because all of these little sections way at the bottom were actually very dark. And this is actually a really dark green that I'm adding in here right now. It's green mixed with a little bit of black, but it's a very dark green, and I'm highlighting these areas that I want the shine to be on my pineapple pieces by going around them with a very dark color. That's how you make a shine in any drawing really stand out in a way that a shine should, is by putting a very dark tone right next to it. It doesn't have to be black. It doesn't have to be a dark color necessarily. It just has to be a dark tone of color, if you understand what I'm saying there. You gotta put in those dark tones, or else your bright shines won't contrast enough. You really need that high level of contrast to make something look extra shiny. I've actually got a watercolor donut coming up here in a little while, a few videos from now. Something to look forward to if you like donuts. But it has a very nice shiny texture over the frosting that I had quite a lot of fun painting. So if you've ever wanted to learn how to paint a donut in watercolors, be sure to subscribe to my channel, because this too shall come to you in time. And now, see, you can start seeing where my shading is having some effect there at that bottom right corner. I've still got a pretty bright outline on the very, very bottom, but some of the shading is really starting to come through. And if I had started these grooves with the dark shading that I have in there right now, it never would have looked as realistic, because you need those layers. You need the layers underneath to make your finished product look how you'd like it to look. Or how I'd like it to look, I suppose. I don't know how you'd like stuff to look. You can make your stuff look however you want, because you're an artist. You can be creative. In fact, I believe people are generally encouraged to be creative as artists. I don't know, I don't go to art classes. Trial and error is my art class, and maybe you can join me on this trial and error art journey if you'd like. But see, now you can start to see my shine coming through, because not only did I put that darker tone on the piece itself, but the very, very dark shadow in between each groove is also helping the shine that occurs on the very edge of each piece. If you can see, I keep pointing at my screen like you guys can see me pointing, but at the very edge of each piece you'll see a little shine, and that's just brought out beautifully by the extra dark grooves I've got going in between here. But this pineapple is really shaping up. It's looking pretty good now. I've still got a white circle in there. I don't know why I left on the bottom left side. I left that white circle much later than I thought I would. Maybe I forgot about it. But I'll remember it here eventually. Oh, now I'm putting in my actual shadow, the cast shadow that the pineapple is casting on the table. And that is super important. For all the shading that you're gonna do, all the detail work you do shading an object, it's the cast shadow that really makes it look like a three-dimensional object. And you need to pay attention to your shadows because they're hardly ever a solid shadow. If you can look here on my shadow, it's actually two different shadows because there was light from a window and light from a lamp when I was looking at this pineapple. And the shadow at the base is darker than the shadow off to the side because of how dramatic and how close the light source was. That dark shadow was cast by my lamp, and that lighter shadow was cast by light from the windows around here. And you'll notice, see where those two shadows overlap is the darkest shadow of all. And that little detail, that little Venn diagram of a shadow with that one very dark spot, really sells the realism of a shadow. A shadow of an object is hardly ever going to be a solid black shape. Really pay attention to how the shadow fades and where it's darkest and where it's lightest. Light seems like a complicated thing to think about when you're creating a drawing, but once you get used to it, it's really not all that bad. You just have to imagine how the light moves, how it reflects off of things, how it bounces off of surfaces. Where there isn't light is just as important as where there is light. I've seen quite a few drawings where people get too involved with one side of the spectrum over the other. They either have tons of beautiful, gorgeous highlights and not enough shadows, not enough dark tones, and that ends up making your drawing look a little flat. It doesn't look... I know I've said this before, so if any of you have been watching my videos in order, I suppose, you'll have heard this before, but value contrast, which is the difference between your light ranges and your dark ranges, is so important. Make sure you have at least a little area that is almost very, very, very dark. And then make sure you have a few areas that are very, very, very light. That's how reality works. You'll almost never see a solid color. Everything is just little beautiful gradations of color. And once you learn to see that in your everyday life, it will really take your art to a new level. See, so now I'm adding in these very darkest shadows on my leaves. I saved these for last because honestly I was a little nervous about these very darkest shadows on my leaves because I liked how they had been looking. And sometimes it's really hard to add those shadows in when you like what it's looking like so far because it seems so dramatic. But it really, really is important. Don't forget those shadows. I added in those there's teeny tiny little leaves at the very base, between where the leaf ends and the pineapple begins. There's these teeny tiny little curls. I don't know if you can see it from this angle, but once we get the still image here at the end, you'll be able to see them, and they're super cool. Tiny little curls of leaf. I'm just adding in some finishing details. I'm making sure all of my little tassels are outlined how I want them. I'm making sure there are shadows where there should be, because all of those leaves cast a shadow, and you have to make sure to represent at least an idea of that in order for it to look good. And now I'm darkening up these shadow bits a little more. You notice I put extra black in the shadows in some places, but not all of them, because the shadow has variation. And now I'm connecting a couple of these, because you couldn't see, when you look at a pineapple like that, you don't see each individual piece by themselves. Very often it sort of blends into together, so I combined a couple of these grooves, a couple of these lines. And there I am with my little bit of white, just a little bit of white, kind of highlighting some of these lighter areas to add in my shine. Any white you add at the end Well, with ink like this, it's not very dramatic, but with something like acrylic, it's a little more fun to add in those highlights at the very end with white because it's so dramatic. It creates such a pretty shine. But this ink did well. It added just a little bit of shine like I wanted it to, and I added some brown mixed with some white. I was going for that papyrus color that the real pineapple tassels were, and I added in some pale highlights with that papyrus color to make my tassel bits a little more three-dimensional, make them pop out a little bit more. It's just these little detail bits that you do toward the end here. See, I made sure there was not a stark white line there around my pineapple anymore. It looks like it fades nicely into the background. Yeah, this is looking good. This is a good pineapple. If you guys draw pineapples, I would love to see them because a pineapple is a special and unique challenge. And if you do a nice pineapple, I would love to see it. Even if you do a not so nice pineapple, because it's all learning. It's all a learning experience. I've got some not so nice drawings. I have one specific drawing that I never show to anyone. I'm so ashamed of it. But everyone has that. Everyone has those drawings. That's okay. There it is. Oh, my pretty pineapple. I have to get the tape taken off, and there's my still image. I think it turned out nice for my first pineapple. I don't know if I will continue to draw pineapples. It was very complicated, very detail-oriented, but I do like how this one turned out. It's a lovely pineapple, even if it did take me 4 or 5 hours. Thank you for coming along with me today. If you want a full-length version of this video, this pineapple process, please let me know, and I'll make that available to you. But have a good rest of your day, you guys. I hope you have fun with your art projects. Goodbye. Goodbye.